There are few people who had as great an impact on how the world stands today as Henry Kissinger did. He advised American presidents, stood toe-to-toe with the likes of Chairman Mao, Golda Meir and Vladimir Putin, changed the fortunes of countries in ways that are still admired, condemned and debated. 70 years ago, as a young man at Harvard, Kissinger wrote that in the life of every person there comes a point when he realizes that out of all the seemingly limitless possibilities of his youth, he has in fact become one actuality. One's journey across the meadows has indeed followed a regular path. I think in this conversation, his last full-length interview, Kissinger's journey was pretty clear. He'd just turned 100, but he had not slowed down much. In fact, he was plainly still involved in public life, still talking to leaders around the world. Now his legacy can be felt from Cuba to Cairo. We broke this interview into 3 geographic parts. Europe, where he was born, the United States, where he found power and fame, and Asia, which he transformed. And then we have a more personal epilogue to do with that legacy. Henry Kissinger was born in 1923 in the German town of Fürth. 2 years later, Adolf Hitler came to the town to denounce its Jewish citizens. I began by asking Henry Kissinger how his first 15 years of persecution and chaos, which only ended when his family escaped to America in 1938, shaped his worldview.
I spent my youth within a disintegrating society. The German society was collapsing into the Hitler period. So gradually, in each election, the Nazi party gained. And then when Hitler finally came to power, I, together with all my family and all the people I knew well, became part of a discriminated minority, living in a town in which there were signs at every public place that Jews are not welcome here, and at the entrance to every town when you entered it by train or car or anywhere. So that was my youth.
Do you think that your view of the world, of something that needed some degree of order, if you look back...
Well, I believe that for a society or for a group in which people lived, stability was a precondition for creativity. Now, that's not a thought I had then so precisely, but stability meant a great deal.
The next time you came back to Germany was in the war. You came back as a soldier, you fought in the Battle of the Bulge, you saw the concentration camps, you took part in this, the rounding up of Nazis, all by the age of like 24, 25. That is a hinterland that very few people in modern politics have. If you look at the people you dealt with, de Gaulle, Mao, all those people, they had seen warfare.
Well, I came back to Germany as a rifleman in the 84th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army. And so I saw war in its most immediate form, under circumstances in which your fellowship with your fellow soldiers is your hope of survival. And everything depends on it. And I was lucky that my fellow soldiers of that period were from northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. It was called the Rail Splitter Division after Lincoln. And so that was the environment. So then, as the battle neared the German border, during the Battle of the Bulge, I was transferred to intelligence, which was still at the front, but not right in it, about 2 miles back in the civilian population. But so I saw the impact of authoritarianism and totalitarianism in my youth, and of war in the next period. And so it was an experience which is so elemental that it becomes part of you, because it shows both the dangers, but also the sense of unity of a community when they believe in fundamental. We know today that German tanks were probably better than our tanks. But you could never convince American soldiers of this because they were convinced that if better tanks could be built, we'd be building them. And I've never forgotten that.
For most of your life, you were dealing with world leaders who had somewhat similar experiences. You could argue, but they'd seen combat. But the last American president to be in that state was the first President Bush. You look around the leaders of the Western world now, they're all people, some of them closer to my age than yours, who've never seen those things. And I wonder whether you think that makes a difference to world politics. Do you worry about that with today's leaders?
I think that leaders who have not had an experience of catastrophe or at the edge of catastrophe sometimes believe they have more options than they really do.
Interesting.
And that is characteristic of our time, especially in the West.
Because the one exception possibly is Xi Jinping, because he went through the Cultural Revolution, didn't he? So he would have had some experience of the terror that you would have seen.
Well, for Xi, a crucial experience was living in a cave with his father after his father, a Red Army leader, was purged by Mao. And in his conversations before he became president, he would refer to the fact that this experience made him strong.
As you said, you grew up in this period of chaos and disintegration. You are seen to be somebody who does not want Russia, if it loses the war in Ukraine, to be overly punished. Is that in part because you saw what happened to Germany? The Germany before the First World War was seemed a very proud, successful country. The best universities, the best all these things. And then humiliation and disintegration follows. Do you worry about that with Russia?
I worry about the fact that Russia has been an integral part of European history for 600 years. And in a very special way, because it is infinitely larger than any European country. And it has always been part of Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. That's a unique aspect of Russia in comparison to the European countries. So it has been torn throughout its history between a desire to become fully European and a fear of European technical superiority or capacity. Europe will become more stable, the world will become more stable when Russia accepts the fact that it cannot conquer Europe, but it has to remain part of Europe by some sort of consensus, as other states do. But I don't want Russia so crushed that it ceases being a factor of international politics in other regions and becomes a subject for European competition among the various states. So it is important for Ukraine to be preserved and for Ukraine to emerge from the war as an autonomous, strong, and democratic country. We have substantially achieved this objective by now. It can still be improved in terms of the borders of Ukraine in the what I hope will be the concluding phases of the war. But I would prefer to preserve Russia because the dissolution of Russia or the reduction of Russia to resentful impotence would set up a new set of tensions.
Do you think Vladimir Putin is somebody who could live with that parameter? You said you want a Russia that realizes where its borders are.
One needs to remember two things about Vladimir Putin, that he is on one level the inheritor of traditional Russia and therefore has the tendencies towards assertion that I've described earlier. But there's also a Vladimir Putin who grew up in the siege of Leningrad, in which over half of the population died of starvation and under constant threat. But he has translated that into never wanting European military power to be in easy reach of St. Petersburg and major cities like Moscow. So when the border of Europe at the end of the war, which was the military border of Europe, which was in the center of Europe, moved to within 300 miles of Moscow and maybe 50 miles of St. Petersburg, he reacted very strongly. And as it turns out, at the edge of irrationality.
You once said to me that Vladimir Putin was more Dostoevsky than Hitler. Do you still think of him in that way?
Yeah, I think he's a Dostoevsky-type figure, beset by ambivalences and unfulfillable aspirations, but not devoted to power in the abstract, but very capable of using power. And as it turned out, he used it excessively in relationship to Ukraine. I would like a Russia that recognizes that its relations to Europe have to be based on agreement and a kind of consensus. And I believe that this war will, if it ended properly, may make it achievable.
If it's ended on the terms you're describing, do you think Vladimir Putin can survive in power?
It's improbable.
On the other side of the fence, at the moment we have the Ukrainian counter-offensive seems to have begun. Do you see that as the last offensive before you have to move to diplomacy and peace talks of some sort?
Well, I began to urge moving towards diplomacy a year ago, when I urged that the various parties to the conflict ask themselves how they want to end it. Not that they would end it right at that point, but that they would know what their political aims were. I think that becomes increasingly important as time goes on, lest we wind up at a point where the war becomes its own objective and where military operations and military relations between powers dominate all of this geopolitical thinking. And at that point, countries like China will have to become, from their point of view, increasingly active. And that would spread it into a world conflict.
Do you think that that is actually the real danger, that the Donbass doesn't become Europe's frontier with Russia? It becomes sort of Europe's frontier with China, that Russia gets driven back into the arms of China?
Well, it could happen because Russia gets driven back or because Russia collapses. And disintegrates as a functioning major autonomous state. And therefore it requires thought in this current phase, which I support. I think we were correct in resisting the attack on Ukraine.
We talked about China and Russia. One power that could emerge much more powerfully from this particular episode is Germany. Germany is probably the country that's going to rebuild Ukraine if it happens. It may be involved in rebuilding Russia. And within Europe, if you visit Spain, if you visit Italy, you can feel that the frontier of Europe has been dragged to the east. So the center of Europe is now closer to Berlin, so to speak. And that Germany, by the fact it's been involved in supplying more arms and everything like that, that it looks set to become a bigger power in Europe. Do you agree with that, firstly? And secondly, do you think that Germany is ready for that task?
I agree that with this description of the transformation of the center of gravity in Europe, it's been inherent since before World War I, and was one of the causes of World War I because of the refusal of other countries to accept this reality, but also because of the inability of Germany to understand the transformation of its own position. Because the leading country has to be an example of moderation and wisdom in balancing the interests of all the countries if they are to be participants in the system. And historically, Germany wanted to exercise its potential by domination. And its tragedy has been, after the retirement of Bismarck, the failure to learn this lesson, which dragged it into two training wars, which altered the entire position of Europe in the world. So now it is again in this position, and it has no leaders with an experience of either the Nazi period or of the war, So they have to construct a system by themselves. And they're new, they're in office only a year or so. And this is not a reflection on their abilities, but a description of a new challenge for them that hasn't existed in that form before.
Do you think that also causes problems for the other great powers? You know, you wrote a lot of history about containing, you know, first containing France, then containing Germany, and now there is an issue. You know, if you are France,
well, if Germany was in conflict with France since the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, because French policy was explicitly based on maintaining the balance of power within Central Europe, which in practice meant maintaining a division of Germany between competing states. And France, partly to mistakes that Germany made, and Britain came to look at Germany as a threat to its sea power. So when the wall fell, neither the British nor the French leader were enthusiastic about the unification of Germany. But the reality is that a British Prime Minister in the 80s and 70s, when Germany was unified, as the last major European country to be unified in 1871, said this will have a greater impact than the French Revolution. So we are at this moment now when a new structure of Europe has to be created based on this reality. And I'm describing the challenge here, not the, I'm not saying that the Germans have failed. It's new, and it's a new challenge for this generation.
It's also a challenge on France and Britain very quickly. They've followed very different paths, especially since Suez. You know, France has very much defined itself often in opposition to America, and it's buried itself in the European Union. The British, by contrast, have tended to stick with the Americans, and now they are outside the European Union. And you and I can argue about who's got things right over the past 50 years, but we are where we are. And I wonder, you look at France and you look at Britain now, who is better placed to go forward? Britain outside the European Union, France inside it?
Psychologically, Britain is better placed, because in the structure of the world that one can imagine appearing, whatever Europe does to its own construction, cooperation with America and pursuing parallel policies with America will have to be an essential component on it, because by itself, opposing all the other major power centers, Europe is in a difficult position to do that, and maybe impossible. So Britain historically is better placed to do it. Britain's problem is its connection, how to connect with Europe, not how to connect with the United States. It has the history of the special partnership and an instinctive fear in Britain that the danger comes from across the oceans and comes from across the border, while in Europe the instinctive fear is the danger comes from land invasion. So for Britain to link to Europe has turned out to be not possible organically. So it now has to be done by policy. And I think that...
So you actually think Britain would... I might disagree with you on this, but you think that Britain is sort of psychologically happier outside the European Union?
Yes, I think it is. And I think it's also a great opportunity for it to act as a link between a unifying Europe and America.
America has never been true to itself unless it meant something beyond itself.
Henry Kissinger said those words about his adopted homeland in 1973. He first arrived in the United States in 1938 as a 15-year-old refugee. I began the second part of our conversation about the United States by asking if his life story was uniquely American. Could he have achieved what he has done anywhere else?
Absolutely uniquely American. I was at a dinner in Germany where the German Chancellor of the Democratic Germany was present, and the American ambassador rather amazingly asked the Chancellor what would have happened to me in Germany if I had survived into this period. And he said, I would be a junior professor in Munich at Munich University.
That brings us very nicely to the next phase of your life. You go to Harvard. I think at different times of your life, you had thought about chemistry and being an accountant, which is a wonderful image. But one of your mentors, Fritz Kramer, had a phrase about you were musically tuned to history. You go to Harvard, and the other kind of great figure of your youth, Bill Elliott, a professor at Harvard, directs you towards the philosophy of history, rather than just history itself. And that's where you get all the Kant or the Spinoza. Is that a really important difference? You've always been obsessed not just by history, but the ideas behind it.
Later on in life, my views and those of many of the academic community at Harvard can be charitably described as not parallel. But in that period of my life, which in a funny way was a second immigration into America, the first from Germany and the second from the army, Harvard played a very important role because it gave me confidence or inspiration, it's a better word, into the direction. I was sort of divided. I was doing extremely well in chemistry, mostly based on memory. And I went to see the head of the chemistry department. His name was Professor Kistiakowski, became a very well-known figure. And I asked him whether I should major in chemistry. And he said, if you have to ask me, no. And so this then, but I was on that other course already inwardly. It gave me the confidence to do it. The philosophy, I was most interested at first in philosophy, in theory of knowledge and theory of values. But history is a way to combine the inherent uncertainties of philosophy, inherent because so far no absolute answers have ever been found by any civilization, with the results of what actually happened. And so as I progressed in development. I became philosophy of history became my dominant theme. And I think if one reads my books, that theme runs through all of them.
Where in your life has that idea of the philosophy of history been the ideas been most challenged by reality? You know, you've said that history is interesting because you get reality conflicting with the ideas.
No, life is torn between managing the present and the evolution of the present, so that in individual lives, and of course magnified into society's lives, there's always the ambiguity that emphasis on the present leads to stagnation, and that therefore everything else around you will outstrip that society. And so how to strike that balance between ultimate values and what reality imposes on you. And reality is never quite adequate, but ultimate values are too absolute because they demand a degree of imposition on others. How to strike that balance is maybe given to us as our insoluble problem to keep our motivation at the appropriate level.
Isn't that quite interesting? Isn't that also the story of American foreign policy? You have this. You've always argued that there's this set of ideals that America wants to live up to.
It's a special problem for America,
yeah,
because we have been as close as it is possible to be satisfied with where we are. And we've been protected by two great oceans, because whenever a society in almost every place else was tempted to be excessively satisfied with itself, its neighbors intruded on them. It was very difficult to do that in America because of these oceans. But after World War II, and now increasingly so, and now with artificial intelligence totally so, we are part of an international or global system, and it goes beyond international, it goes beyond its universal system. And we have simultaneously to adjust to that and conduct a day-to-day policy with countries that have the same situation, and with other countries that grow up to our level of achievement that's never existed before in history.
You've always said America should balance a sort of shining city on a hill complex with reality, and you look at the last Cold War, and America won it by kind of singing a song of liberty, of those ideals, but also by doing really basic things, helping people, the Marshall Plan and things like that. If you go to America's allies, they will say America doesn't talk about those ideals any longer. It just talks about America first. And in terms of trade deals and things like that, America isn't, it's not even doing trade deals with its allies in either Asia or Europe. So that America, in a strange way, is more disconnected from what it should be than it has been.
Well, actually, in fact, America is not more disconnected. It's probably more connected than it's been in what is considered the great period of American history, except that during the Marshall Plan, at the end of World War II, all this was new. So it was a new experience, and it was therefore, it became very significant in day-to-day thinking of policymakers. Now policymakers are torn between, and at that time we had over 50% of the world's gross national product. Now we are down to about 24%, which is still a huge percentage, and still an extremely influential percentage. But it requires us to be more discriminating. So it looks as if we are retrenching. The problem that bothers me is not basically the retrenching, but we have not yet found a concept that unifies Americans. And so now the advocacy of the realization that we need a new idea for world order has shrunk to a much smaller group than existed at the end of World War II. Our challenge is conceptual more than practical.
When you came to power, America had had a long period where it had been able to lecture the world. America was going through great difficulties then. It was going through things. You had the gas price. You had all these things going wrong, and America didn't. You had to scramble. You had to try and find allies. You had to try and make things work. You've had another period, from the Berlin Wall onwards, where America seemed very strong. Now again, it's stuck having to make allies, having to find balances. Is there a comparison there at all?
We now are living in a world of unprecedented complexity. The need for allies exists, but what allies are supposed to do in given circumstances and how the alliances are supposed to operate when every issue has a global component, but not every issue has a comparable interest for every country, so that countries, they all have a global interest in global stability, but they don't have the same interest in the immediate situation. Secondly, there has now, when I was given the opportunity to participate in policy making, that was essentially the 70s and early 80s. All these issues we're discussing were beginning were in their infancy, and so that their very existence was in dispute. And one of the contributions of Nixon was that he was willing to face these new realities. But now they're upon us, and in that sense there is an evolution of the problems, as you suggest in your question.
Do you think now America is a worse ally? I mean, if I go to Paris or I go to Jakarta, they will say, all we hear from America is we hear America first, and we hear we don't want to do trade deals, we don't want to do things with you. There is no There is no sense of reaching out, and they would probably say that Joe Biden is a little bit more polite than Donald Trump.
I would say,
but no more helpful.
The debate within America had shifted to the extremes. So the difference between, say, liberal Republicans and Democrats in the 70s and 80s was about the degree of a participation in which they both shared. In the present period, the debate had shifted to extremes in which there is an extreme theory of America first, which is applied on both sides, but in such a way that it focuses too much on American interests and not on global interests. That is a challenge. But anyone who wants to conduct a serious American foreign policy must balance the two, or America will become isolated.
Do you think the current administration is doing a serious job at that?
I think the current administration is trying to do a serious job of that, but it is so afraid of attacks on itself that it doesn't do itself justice.
You were a Rockefeller Republican. Nowadays, there are no Rockefeller Republicans. There's Democrats on one extreme, there's Republicans on the other. This center of American politics, the fact it's disappeared, do you think that has dramatic foreign policy implications?
I think that center still exists, but it doesn't have doesn't have an articulate expression yet.
Would you ever like to see an independent party in America?
Well, independent parties in America have not had a good fate,
yes.
But I do think it is important to maintain an argument for the philosophy that I have maintained, not because I've maintained it, but because it reflects the necessity of our period, and that becomes magnified if you consider that we are now in the field of artificial intelligence at the very beginning of a colossal transformation of human consciousness, which will have to be built into this foreign policy.
But we have a paradox, don't we? You have these issues. You have artificial intelligence, you have climate change, you have maybe the global economy, where interconnectedness is incredibly important, but America doesn't seem to follow it.
That is in the current world. But the essence of what I'm concerned about is that we have opened the door to a dialogue with objects and with machines. That when the printing press was invented, it transformed the human consciousness and set off what we call now the Enlightenment, which has been going on for 500 years. Now these machines, what is the essence of these machines? We ask a question of these machines. These machines are then capable of encompassing all the knowledge that we have taught them, but that we cannot contain in one brain or one machine. Look at it, give us an answer, and we act on the basis of that. That is a new reality that will be studied for decades, like the old new reality was when the printing press permitted exchanging information easily.
But the printing press was at a time of nation states, or where nation states were coming to the fore, where you had an immediate need to interact with other ones. It was part of what appeared. AI is coming part, in, as you described, in America, which doesn't have borders.
No, but I think America will be driven by reality into studying what and so will all other countries. It's not an American thing, but it's become a high-tech thing. So therefore, it will be a dialogue between, therefore the dialogue between America and China will become more important, even more crucial. But it will change the way we interpret reality, because due to our achievement, we have found the key to a new aspect of reality which we didn't know existed.
One last thing on America. Given the huge complexity of what you've described, do you think that a presidential election between Joe Biden and Donald Trump offers somebody who is capable of dealing with that degree of complexity?
It's going to be very difficult. It's a painful question. We have to live with what exists, and we mustn't turn our disputes into civil wars.